Grace, positioned where she could observe the movement of the guests, turned on the first flashlight in the west window, signaling that Blackwood was moving toward the designated area. The signal was quickly relayed through the network of conspirators, each taking their final positions with the precision of soldiers executing a rehearsed military maneuver. Blackwood, accompanied by 5 other white men curious about his promised demonstration, walked toward the discipline barn carrying a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey. He was clearly excited by the opportunity to display his techniques to an appreciative audience, unaware that he was walking directly into a trap months in the making. As Blackwood and his companions entered the barn, Grace turned on the second flashlight, confirming that the target was in the designated location. Lydia, hidden in the nearby shadows, felt her heart race as the moment she had dreamed of for so long finally approached. She checked one last time. The knife she had hidden in her clothing, a blade Samuel had sharpened especially for this occasion. Inside the barn, Blackwood began his gruesome demonstration. He had brought 2 young slaves as volunteers for his display, and he began explaining to his inebriated guests his philosophies about breaking slave resistance through psychological humiliation combined with physical pain. The white men laughed and applauded as Blackwood demonstrated various whipping techniques, completely oblivious to the fact that every scream of pain from the slaves was heard by dozens of their companions hidden in the shadows around them. It was then that the first deviation from the original plan occurred. One of the white guests, apparently bored by the demonstration or uncomfortable with its extreme brutality, decided to return to the main party. When he emerged from the barn alone, Big Jim, following pre-established instructions on handling unforeseen situations, intercepted him in the shadows. What happened next was swift and silent. The man was knocked unconscious with a single blow from a hammer and dragged to a ditch prepared to hide bodies. The third lantern was lit when Marcus confirmed that Blackwood was distracted by his demonstration and vulnerable. This was the signal Lydia had been waiting for. Accompanied by 3 of her closest conspirators, she moved silently toward the barn, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it could be heard by the men inside. What unfolded over the next 30 minutes would be remembered as one of the most brutal outbursts of violence in the history of American slave resistance. Lydia and her companions entered the barn through a side entrance that Samuel had modified weeks earlier, removing the hinges to allow for silent entry. The sound of Blackwood's demonstration and the drunken laughter of his guests completely masked any noise they might have made. Blackwood stood with his back to the entrance, focused on his audience as he demonstrated a particularly cruel technique involving heated iron. He was in the middle of explaining how fear of future pain was more effective than present pain when Lydia emerged from the shadows behind him. For a moment, that felt like an eternity. She simply watched him. This man who had destroyed so many lives, raped her daughter, and terrorized her community for years. Then, without a word or a sound, Lydia planted her knife between Blackwood's shoulder blades, piercing him deeply into the heart from behind. The foreman stiffened, his eyes widening in shock and confusion as he tried to process what had happened. He tried to turn away, tried to speak, but only blood bubbled from his mouth as he fell to his knees. What followed was utter chaos. The white guests, instantly sobered by the shock of what they were witnessing, tried to flee, but found the exits blocked by armed slaves. Some tried to fight, others begged for mercy, but the pent-up rage of years of brutality brooked no compassion. Within minutes, every white man in the barn was dead, their bodies strewn across the bloody floor where so many slaves had suffered before them. But Lydia wasn't finished with Blackwood. Even as he lay dying on the floor, she knelt beside him and whispered in his ear, "This is for my daughter and for all the other children you've destroyed." Then, with the same knife she'd used to attack him, she systematically mutilated Blackwood's body in ways that mirrored the torments he'd inflicted on others. Only when he finally stopped breathing did she allow herself a moment of satisfaction. The sound of fighting in the barn had been heard at the main party, and some of the other white overseers began investigating. They were met by Marcus and his cell, who had positioned themselves to intercept any interference. A second wave of violence swept through the property as the conspirators moved to eliminate any white people who might organize resistance or retaliation. Samuel had started fires in 3 secondary structures, creating confusion and distracting attention from the main events. The flames illuminated the night with a demonic light that seemed appropriate for the violence unfolding throughout the plantation. Screams of terror and sounds of struggle echoed through the property as years of oppression found their explosive release. The night of blood and vengeance. What began as a surgical execution of Jeremiah Blackwood quickly escalated into a full-blown insurrection that would sweep across Riverdale Plantation in waves of violence that respected no age, gender, or innocence. The foreman's death had broken a dam of pent-up hatred that had built up for generations, and now that fury flowed freely through the estate like a destructive flood. News of Blackwood's death spread through the slave population with supernatural speed. Slaves who had no prior knowledge of Lydia's conspiracy began to emerge from their huts, initially simply to test whether the impossible rumors could be true. When they saw the bodies of the white overseers and the flames rising from the burning buildings, something primal and powerful was unleashed in their souls. Big Jim had taken command of a growing group of slaves who had armed themselves with anything they could find: axes, scythes, stones, pieces of wood. He led them toward the main house, where Colonel Whitmore and his family were desperately trying to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed their estate. The family had barricaded themselves on the second floor, but the doors and windows offered little protection from the fury of hundreds of people who had decided that years of suffering required bloody retribution. Lydia, still covered in Blackwood's blood, became a near mythical figure in the night. Slaves who saw her spread the word that she had slain the demon that terrorized them, and her presence inspired others to acts of violence they never would have imagined possible. She moved through the estate like a vengeful fury, directing groups toward specific targets and ensuring that no white overseer escaped the retribution that was sweeping across the plantation. The main house was stormed around midnight. Colonel Whitmore attempted to negotiate with the invaders, offering money, promises of better treatment, even freedom for some in exchange for their families being spared. But his words fell on deaf ears. The slaves had heard promises before, only to discover they were worth less than the paper they could be written on. Tonight, only blood would satisfy the debt that had accumulated over decades. Mama Rose led a group of women on a private mission to find and destroy all the slave ownership records Whitmore kept in his office. They knew these documents represented their legal chains, and burning them was a symbolic act of liberation as important as the physical violence being perpetrated elsewhere. The papers were piled in the courtyard and set ablaze, their flames rising as offerings to the spirits of all those who had died under the yoke of slavery. Samuel had organized groups to free slaves from neighboring plantations, expanding the insurrection beyond Riverdale's borders. Racing through the darkness with torches and improvised weapons, they attacked 3 smaller estates before dawn, killing overseers and freeing over 200 additional slaves. The rebellion was spreading like wildfire across the county, each success inspiring new acts of resistance. But it was in Blackwood's shrieking shack that the most brutal acts of retribution were committed. Lydia personally led a group to completely destroy the barn where so many had suffered. They didn't just burn it, they dismantled it piece by piece, breaking every instrument of torture, destroying every symbol of the oppression that had defined their lives. It was as if they were exorcising literal demons from the place that had been their own version of hell. Throughout the night, the violence was accompanied by a surreal soundtrack of spiritual songs. The slaves sang hymns of liberation as they fought, their voices rising in harmonies that transformed the carnage into something approaching religious ritual. Go Down Moses, Swing Low Sweet Chariot, and other songs that had sustained their faith through years of suffering now served as war marches for their liberation. Not all white people on the estate were killed. Some women and children were spared, not out of mercy, but because certain slaves intervened on their behalf. Grace saved Whitmore's youngest daughter, a 7-year-old girl who had always been kind to the house slaves. Marcus protected a young overseer who had secretly helped 6 slaves in the past. These acts of selectivity demonstrated that even amidst their murderous rage, the rebels retained some capacity for moral distinction. As the night wore on, the logistics of the insurrection became increasingly complex. Improvised leaders emerged among the freed slaves, organizing groups for different tasks. Some continued military operations against remaining overseers. Others began gathering supplies and weapons for the journey they knew lay ahead. Still others focused on locating and reuniting families who had been separated. Lydia found herself at the center of all this activity, her natural leadership and the respect she had earned through Blackwood's assassination making her a de facto authority among the rebels. She established a makeshift command center in the main house, where decisions about targets, timing, and strategy were made. Her transformation from oppressed slave to military leader had happened in a matter of hours, driven by necessity and crisis. By 3 in the morning, it became clear that Riverdale Plantation was completely under the control of the rebellious slaves. More than 40 white people were dead, including all the overseers and most of the Whitmore family. Fires had destroyed most of the main structures, and hundreds of slaves had been freed not only from Riverdale, but also from neighboring properties that had also been attacked. But Lydia knew her victory was temporary. News of the uprising would spread quickly, and military authorities would be sent to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. The question now was not whether they could hold the territory they had seized, but whether they could use their temporary advantage to escape to free territories, or at least sell their lives dearly enough to inspire other similar uprisings. As dawn approached, painting the sky with bloody hues that seemed appropriate for the night's events, Lydia allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Blackwood was dead, her daughter had been avenged, and hundreds of people had experienced, however briefly, a taste of freedom. No matter what happened in the hours and days to come, she had achieved something few slaves in American history had. She had made her oppressors pay a real price for their cruelties. The authorities' response and the hunt. The dawn of September 24th brought with it the brutal reality that Riverdale's night of freedom had come to an end. As first light revealed the extent of the destruction, bodies strewn across the fields, buildings still smoking, and hundreds of armed slaves organized into makeshift military groups, it became clear that Mississippi was facing the largest slave uprising in its history. News of the uprising had reached authorities even before dawn. A supervisor from a neighboring plantation, who had escaped the night raids, rode desperately to Natchez to warn the county sheriff of what he described as an all-out race war spreading across the region. His feverish descriptions of slaves murdering entire white families and burning plantations created immediate panic among the local white population. Sheriff James Morrison, a veteran of the Native American Wars, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. He urgently dispatched horsemen to Jackson, the state capital, requesting military troops, and simultaneously began organizing local militias to quell the rebellion before it could spread further. Morrison knew from experience that slave insurrections, if not crushed quickly and brutally, could inspire similar uprisings throughout the South. As the authorities mobilized, Lydia and the other rebellion leaders faced their own critical decisions. They had perhaps 6 hours before organized military forces arrived in the region. Some argued that they should disperse immediately, breaking into small groups that could escape through the swamps and forests toward the free territories of the North. Others insisted that they should stay and fight, using the plantation's defensive structures to hold out for as long as possible. Lydia favored a third option, an organized retreat that would maximize the number of slaves who could escape while leaving a rearguard force to slow the pursuers. She argued that the goal of the rebellion had been liberation, not martyrdom, and that each person's freedom would be a victory that justified the sacrifices made. Her influence among the rebels was sufficient for her strategy to be accepted by the majority. Implementation of this strategy began immediately. The slaves were organized into 3 main groups: families with young children, who would be evacuated first via swamp routes that offered maximum cover; strong young men who would form mobile combat units to harass the search forces; and volunteers who would remain on the plantation to conduct delaying operations. Samuel led the first evacuation column, guiding nearly 100 freed slaves along trails he had scouted over the previous weeks. This group included Lydia's daughter Sarah, whom she had decided to send to safety despite the pain of separation. The group carried supplies gathered from the main house and the plantation storerooms, enough to sustain them for a journey of several weeks. Big Jim organized mobile combat units, arming the most experienced men with the best weapons they had captured from dead overseers. These groups would be instructed to move quickly through the region, attacking search patrols and creating confusion that would hamper efforts to track down the main fugitives. It was practically a suicide mission, but volunteers were plentiful among men who had tasted freedom and would rather die fighting. than return to captivity. Lydia took personal command of the delaying force that would remain in Riverdale. This group of approximately 40 people had volunteered to fight a rearguard action that would give the evacuation columns as much time as possible to escape. They positioned themselves in the ruins of the burned buildings, creating makeshift defensive positions and setting traps for the forces they knew would arrive. Around 10 in the morning, the first military patrols arrived near Riverdale. A company of county militia, commanded by Captain William Hayes, established a perimeter around the plantation and began reconnaissance operations to determine the rebels' strength and position. Hayes, a seasoned veteran, immediately recognized that he was dealing with enemies who had organized themselves in a much more sophisticated manner than the typical slave insurrection. The first military confrontation occurred when a reconnaissance patrol attempted to approach the main house. The defenders, hidden in the ruins, opened fire with captured muskets, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 3 others. The accuracy of the fire and the tactical discipline demonstrated by the former slaves shocked the military officers who had expected to encounter a disorganized mob rather than effective combatants. Hayes quickly realized that a direct assault would result in unacceptable casualties among his troops. Instead, he established a siege, sending messengers to request reinforcements and artillery while beginning systematic operations to isolate the defenders and cut off any possibility of escape or resupply. As the siege unfolded, Lydia and her defenders waged a campaign of psychological terror against the attacking troops. They displayed the mutilated bodies of Blackwood and other overseers in prominent positions, sending a clear message about the fate that awaited any white man who attempted to restore the old system. They also used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to conduct guerrilla attacks that kept the military troops constantly tense and alert. Psychological warfare worked on both sides. Military troops began summarily executing any captured slaves, hanging their bodies from trees around the perimeter as warnings to the defenders. This brutality only intensified the rebels' resolve, confirming that surrender would mean tortured death rather than a return to captivity. Around noon, significant military reinforcements arrived from Jackson, including 2 companies of regular infantry and an artillery battery. The commanding general, Colonel Marcus Thompson, assumed control of the operation and immediately ordered preparations for a systematic bombardment of the rebel positions. Thompson was known for his brutality in previous campaigns against Native Americans, and he saw the slave uprising as an opportunity to demonstrate that such challenges to white authority would be crushed without mercy. The bombardment began at 2 in the afternoon, with cannons systematically firing at any structure that might shelter defenders. The ruins of the main house, already damaged by the previous night's fires, collapsed completely under artillery fire. The defenders were forced to withdraw to more dispersed positions, abandoning any hope of organized resistance in favor of isolated sniper actions. Lydia, wounded by shrapnel during the bombardment, but still capable of fighting, made the decision to order the final withdrawal. The objectives of the delaying action had been accomplished. The evacuation columns had gained nearly an 8-hour head start, and the military troops had been delayed and disorganized by the fighting. It was time for the survivors of the rearguard force to attempt their own escape. The retreat was conducted in small groups, each following different routes through the swamps and forests surrounding the plantation. Some managed to escape. Others were hunted down and killed by cavalry patrols, dispatched to intercept fugitives. Lydia herself disappeared into the murky waters of the Great Black Swamp, and her fate would remain a mystery that would spawn legends for generations. The relentless hunt for the fugitives. What followed the crushing of organized resistance in Riverdale was one of the most extensive and brutal manhunts in the history of the antebellum South. Mississippi authorities, terrified that the insurrection might inspire similar uprisings elsewhere, mobilized unprecedented resources to capture or kill every slave who had participated in the rebellion. Colonel Thompson established his headquarters in Natchez and organized a multi-pronged search operation. Regular army troops were supplemented by local militia, professional slave hunters, and packs of specially trained sniffer dogs to track fugitives. A $1,000 reward, a fortune at the time, was offered for information leading to Lydia's capture, making her one of the most wanted individuals in the state. Big Jim's mobile combat units waged a guerrilla campaign that kept the Search forces on constant alert for weeks. They attacked isolated patrols, sabotaged communication lines, and set up ambushes where the terrain offered the defenders an advantage. Each attack was followed by a rapid retreat through swamps and forests that the regular soldiers considered impassable. The first significant capture occurred 5 days after the rebellion, when a cavalry patrol encountered a group of 15 fugitives attempting to cross the Mississippi River at night. A fierce pursuit resulted in the deaths of 8 rebels and the capture of the remaining 7. These prisoners were taken back to Natchez, where they were subjected to brutal interrogations to extract information about the plans and routes of the other fugitives. The interrogation methods employed by the authorities went far beyond the normal punishments meted out to slaves. Prisoners were systematically tortured, whipped until unconscious, then revived for further questioning, subjected to hot irons and mutilation, and deprived of food and water for days. The goal was not only to obtain information, but to create such horrific examples that they would discourage any future thought of resistance among the enslaved population. 3 of the captured prisoners died during these interrogations without revealing any useful information. The 4 survivors were publicly executed in Natchez's main square, their deaths watched by thousands of white spectators and slaves who were forced to attend as a warning. The bodies were left hanging for days as macabre reminders of the fate that awaited the rebels. Meanwhile, the evacuation columns led by Samuel continued their epic journey toward the free territories. They had split into smaller groups to make detection more difficult, but this also meant each group was more vulnerable if discovered. The journey through the swamps was treacherous even under normal circumstances. Waters infested with alligators, venomous snakes, unstable ground that could swallow a man whole, and insect-borne diseases that killed as effectively as bullets. The group, which included Lydia's daughter Sarah, faced particular challenges due to the presence of young children who couldn't maintain the pace necessary to outrun mounted pursuers. Samuel made the difficult decision to establish temporary camps on isolated islands in the marshes, where the groups could rest and regroup while scouts verified safe routes ahead. It was in one of these temporary camps that one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire persecution occurred. A patrol of slave hunters, guided by sniffer dogs, discovered the location of a group of 40 fugitives, including 15 children. The patrol leader, a man named Jake Morrison, known for his cruelty, ordered an immediate attack without regard for the non-combatants in the group. What Morrison didn't expect was that the fugitives had prepared defenses for just this situation. Sharpened stake traps were hidden along the approach trails, and the men in the group were positioned in defensive positions that maximized their advantage over the familiar terrain. When the hunters attacked, they were met with fierce resistance that resulted in the deaths of 4 attackers, including Morrison himself. This defensive success came at a terrible cost. 3 children were killed during the attack, and 7 adults were injured, some seriously. Worse still, the sound of gunfire had alerted other patrols in the area, forcing the fugitives to abandon their safe camp and continue their journey through even more dangerous territory. The support network for fugitive slaves in Mississippi was far less developed than in more northern states, but some courageous abolitionists offered limited assistance. A Quaker merchant named Ezra Williams operated a safe house in a remote location near the Tennessee border, and he was able to temporarily shelter some of the smaller groups of fugitives. Williams risked not only his own life, but the safety of his entire family by offering this sanctuary. When authorities became suspicious of his activities, he was subjected to constant surveillance, and his property was searched multiple times. Only his respected standing in the local Quaker community and the lack of direct evidence saved him from arrest or worse. Mama Rose, who had chosen to join combat units rather than flee with the evacuation columns, became a legendary figure among the guerrillas. Her advanced age masked a keen tactical mind and intimate knowledge of poisonous plants, which she used to create deadly traps for search patrols. She personally killed at least 12 soldiers using poison darts and contaminated water before finally being captured. Mama Rose's capture was a devastating blow to the morale of the remaining rebels. She was brutally tortured for days, with authorities hoping that her age and fragile physical condition would break her quickly. Instead, she endured the torments with stoic dignity, refusing to reveal any information about the other fugitives' whereabouts or plans. Her final execution in the public square became a symbol of resistance that would inspire future abolitionist movements. As September turned into October, it became clear that most of the fugitives had successfully eluded the immediate search net. Estimates suggested that over 200 slaves had made it from Mississippi, many likely to the northern territories where they had a chance at freedom. But the cost had been high. At least 100 rebels were killed in combat or executed after capture. Mississippi authorities declared victory, but the reality was more complicated. The rebellion had demonstrated that slaves could organize militarily and conduct sophisticated operations that posed a real threat to the slave system. More importantly, it had created legends and stories that would spread throughout slave communities, inspiring other acts of resistance in the years to come. Lydia's legacy of revenge. In the years following what became known as the Cotton Massacre, the story of Lydia and her bloody revenge against Jeremiah Blackwood evolved into something much larger than the actual historical events. Her narrative became a powerful legend that spread throughout the slave communities of the South, inspiring acts of resistance and offering hope to those suffering under the yoke of slavery. Lydia's ultimate fate remained a mystery that fueled speculation for decades. Some stories claimed she died in the waters of the Great Black Swamp, her body never found among the alligators and snakes that guarded her secrets. Other versions insisted she had escaped to the north, where she lived under an assumed identity, perhaps even helping other fugitives through the Underground Railroad. The most persistent version of the legend claimed that Lydia had survived and settled in a maroon community deep in the Louisiana swamps, where she continued organizing rescue operations for slaves from surrounding plantations. Supposed sightings of a mysterious woman who aided runaways were reported throughout the region during the 1860s, always described as a fierce-looking figure with distinctive scars and eyes that burned with the fire of vengeance. The rebellion's immediate impact on the region was severe. Mississippi authorities implemented even more restrictive slave codes, prohibiting any gathering of more than 3 slaves without white supervision, drastically limiting movement between plantations and establishing permanent night patrols. The fear of further uprisings had become deeply ingrained in the white psyche, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that would affect race relations in the region for generations. Plantation owners across the state intensified their control methods, some hiring more armed overseers, others implementing surveillance systems that relied on informants among the slaves themselves. Ironically, these repressive measures only served to further radicalize the slave population, creating resentment that would eventually contribute to additional uprisings in the years leading up to the Civil War. Lydia's story also had a significant impact on the Northern abolitionist movement. Accounts of the rebellion, though often exaggerated or romanticized, were used by abolitionist orators as evidence of the inherent brutality of the slave system and the natural courage of enslaved people when facing extreme oppression. Frederick Douglass specifically referenced the indomitable spirit of the Mississippi heroine in several of his most famous speeches. Harriet Beecher Stowe incorporated elements of Lydia's story into later versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, creating a composite character based in part on her revenge against Blackwood. This fictionalization helped spread the narrative to an even wider audience, though it also contributed to the romanticization of aspects that had in reality been brutally violent. Lydia's daughter Sarah eventually made it to free territory, settling in Cincinnati's black community. She carefully preserved her mother's stories, passing them on to her own children, along with lessons about dignity, resilience, and the price of freedom. Sarah lived until 1923, becoming a respected figure in the community and always insisting that her mother had been a hero, not a murderer. During the Civil War, several black Union soldier units adopted Lydia's revenge as their battle cry, particularly during campaigns in Mississippi. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, famous for its courage at the Battle of Fort Wagner, carried an unofficial flag embroidered with the words, "Remember Riverdale," by free black women from Boston. After the war and during the Reconstruction period, the site of the former Riverdale plantation became a pilgrimage site for former slaves who came to pay tribute to those who had died fighting for freedom. A makeshift cemetery was established where the bodies of the rebel dead had been buried in mass graves, and families traveled hundreds of miles to leave flowers and say prayers. The systematic suppression of Lydia's story began during the post-Reconstruction period, when local officials and white historians deliberately worked to erase records of the rebellion. Official documents were destroyed or reclassified, witnesses were intimidated into silence, and sanitized versions of events were promoted to replace the more accurate narratives that had previously circulated. This campaign of historical suppression was so effective that by 1900, many specific aspects of the rebellion had been lost to official history. Only oral traditions preserved in black communities kept the full memory of the events alive, passing stories from generation to generation through songs, sermons, and family narratives. The academic rediscovery of Lydia's story began in the 1960s, when historians of the civil rights movement began systematically excavating neglected records of slave resistance. Dr. John Hope Franklin was one of the first scholars to identify consistent references to the Riverdale Rebellion in military documents preserved in federal archives. Subsequent research revealed the extraordinary scope of Lydia's conspiracy and the military sophistication of the resistance she organized. Analysis of military records showed that authorities had viewed the rebellion as a genuine threat to regional security, mobilizing resources normally reserved for conflicts with foreign nations or indigenous wars. The discovery of personal letters written by soldiers who participated in the suppression provided first-hand insights into the discipline and courage displayed by the rebels. One lieutenant wrote to his wife, "These are not slaves as we know them, but warriors fighting for something they value more than their own lives. Their determination is both inspiring and terrifying." Modern scholarship on historical trauma has identified Lydia's rebellion as a prime example of collective resistance that helped enslaved communities maintain dignity and agency even under conditions of extreme oppression. Psychologists have noted that stories about her revenge provided important emotional catharsis for people who had no other means of processing the systemic violence they faced. Lydia's narrative also influenced liberation movements in other historical contexts. During the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, leaders such as Amilcar Cabral and Nelson Mandela made specific reference to the example of organized resistance she had set, arguing that the oppressed always had the moral right to use violence against their oppressors. Contemporary African-American artists continue to find inspiration in Lydia's story. Novelists like Toni Morrison have incorporated elements of her narrative into fictional works, painters have created visual representations of her revenge, and musicians have composed songs that echo the spiritual traditions that sustained the rebels during their struggle. In 2020, Black Lives Matter activists organized a memorial ceremony at the site of the former Riverdale plantation, now a suburban residential development. Hundreds of people attended to honor Lydia and her companions, planting a memorial tree and installing a plaque officially recognizing the events that had been denied and forgotten for over 150 years. Historical truth rediscovered the modern. Reconstruction of the true story of the Cotton Massacre represents one of the most significant historical recovery projects ever undertaken by scholars of American slavery. Over decades, the meticulous work of archaeologists, historians, and oral tradition experts has revealed a narrative far more complex and nuanced than the legends that had preserved Lydia's memory for generations. The most important discovery came in 1987, when archaeological excavations at the former Riverdale site revealed extensive physical evidence of the events of September 1856. Layers of ash confirmed reports of fires that had destroyed multiple structures, while recovered artifacts included improvised weapons, modified tools, and even fragments of documents that had been burned during the destruction of slavery records. Most dramatically, archaeologists discovered mass graves containing the remains of at least 40 individuals, both white and black, who had died violently during the rebellion. Forensic analysis of the bones confirmed historical accounts of the brutality of the fighting, revealing evidence of stab wounds, head trauma, and other injuries consistent with intense military engagement. DNA analysis of recovered bones allowed specific identifications of some of the rebellion's participants. Remains found at a special location were confirmed through comparisons with living descendants as belonging to Samuel, the blacksmith who had led the evacuation columns. This discovery confirmed traditional accounts that he had returned to fight alongside Lydia during the final stages of the resistance. Documents discovered in previously classified state and federal archives have revealed the true extent of the military mobilization against the rebels. Military records show that more than 1,500 soldiers were eventually mobilized to suppress the rebellion and hunt down fugitives, a number exceeding the forces used in many campaigns against hostile indigenous nations. Correspondence between military officials revealed that authorities were genuinely concerned about the potential for the rebellion to spread to other states. Urgent telegrams were sent to the governors of Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia, warning of the possibility of similar insurrections and requesting that preventive measures be implemented immediately. The work of collecting oral traditions by researchers such as Dr. Charles Joyner revealed that stories about Lydia had been preserved with remarkable accuracy across 6 generations. Comparisons between versions of the story told by families in different states showed extraordinary consistency in specific details, confirming the reliability of oral transmission as a method of historical preservation. A particularly significant discovery was the discovery of a diary kept by Grace, the domestic slave who had provided crucial intelligence for the conspiracy. The diary, written in a combination of English and code based on African traditions, provided first-hand insight into the preparations for the rebellion and the participants' feelings during the events. The diary entries revealed that the conspiracy had been even more extensive than previously understood, including sympathizers on at least 5 different plantations and a communication network that stretched across 3 counties. Grace also documented attempts to contact northern abolitionists to coordinate escape routes, though these efforts apparently were unsuccessful. Newspaper research from the time revealed that news of the rebellion had spread far more widely than local officials had acknowledged. Newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia published detailed accounts of the events, often portraying Lydia as a heroine of freedom and criticizing the brutality of the military response. These newspaper accounts also revealed that the rebellion had inspired smaller acts of resistance elsewhere. Mysterious fires on plantations in Georgia and Louisiana during October 1856 were attributed by authorities to Lydia sympathizers, though direct evidence was never established. The discovery of medical records from military hospitals provided information about casualties among government forces that had been downplayed in official accounts. Documents show that at least 50 soldiers were killed or wounded during suppression operations, a much higher number than officially acknowledged at the time. Comparative analysis with other historical slave rebellions revealed that Lydia's conspiracy was unique in its combination of long-term strategic planning, disciplined military organization, and goals that went beyond simple escape to include systematic retribution against specific oppressors. Studies of the effectiveness of the rebels' tactics have shown that their strategies were surprisingly sophisticated, incorporating principles of guerrilla warfare that would not be formally codified by military theorists until decades later. The compartmentalization of information, the use of communication codes, and the coordination of simultaneous operations demonstrated organizational capacity that challenged stereotypes about the capabilities of enslaved people. The rediscovery of Lydia's true story culminated in 2019 with the publication of Flames of Vengeance: The Lydia Washington Rebellion, a scholarly biography that synthesized decades of multidisciplinary research. Written by Dr. Angela Davis, the book presented the first comprehensive, evidence-based narrative of the events of September 1856. This scholarly work confirmed that Lydia had been a genuine military leader whose rebellion represented one of the most significant examples of organized slave resistance in American history. Far from being simply a story of personal revenge, her uprising demonstrated leadership skills, strategic planning, and moral courage that rivaled any military leader of her time. The publication also definitively established that many of the legends about Lydia were in fact accurate historical accounts that had been faithfully preserved through oral traditions when written records were deliberately destroyed or suppressed by hostile authorities. We have reached the end of this extraordinary journey through one of the most powerful and disturbing stories of American slave resistance. Lydia's revenge against Jeremiah Blackwood and the subsequent massacre at Riverdale Plantation represent more than simply an episode of violence. They illustrate the human capacity to organize resistance even under the most oppressive conditions, and the terrible price both oppressors and oppressed pay when systematic injustice finally finds its violent response. Lydia's story forces us to confront complex moral questions about violence, justice, and the limits of legitimate resistance. She was not a saint or a perfect heroine. She was a human woman who, faced with the rape of her daughter and years of systematic brutality, chose a path of revenge that led to the deaths of dozens of people. Her actions cannot be easily categorized as purely heroic or purely criminal. They exist in an ambiguous moral space that reflects the inherent complexity of situations where entire systems of oppression create conditions impossible for justice through peaceful means. What is undeniable is the extraordinary courage Lydia demonstrated in organizing and leading a rebellion that she knew would likely result in her own death. She chose to resist, even when resistance seemed futile, and her choice inspired hundreds of others to risk everything for the chance of freedom. The fact that so many managed to escape to live free lives gives lasting meaning to the sacrifices made during those bloody September nights. The deliberate suppression of this story for over a century demonstrates how institutional power can be used to control historical narratives and erase memories that challenge convenient versions of the past. The rediscovery of Lydia's true story through persistent academic research and the preservation of oral traditions illustrates the importance of protecting all historical voices, especially those of people who have been marginalized or silenced by dominant power structures. If you're moved by this powerful story of resistance, courage, and the price of freedom, please show it by liking this video. Your like not only motivates me to continue researching and telling these important historical narratives, but it also helps others discover stories that have been forgotten or deliberately suppressed for too long. Subscribe to the channel to receive more stories about historical figures who defied injustice and fought for freedom, even when the personal cost was extreme. These narratives remind us that history is made by ordinary people who choose extraordinary acts of courage when faced with impossible circumstances. I encourage you to watch the video currently playing on your screen, which explores other stories of slave resistance and the methods enslaved people developed to maintain dignity and agency under conditions of extreme oppression. Each story adds an important piece to our understanding of how freedom was achieved through sacrifice and determination. Thank you for taking the time to learn about Lydia Washington and the complex legacy of her revenge. May her story inspire us to confront injustices in our own time with comparable courage, always remembering that freedom is rarely won without cost, and that those who fought for it in the past deserve to be remembered as much for their sacrifices as for their victories. The Cotton Massacre, Lydia's revenge against the overseer in the Mississippi fields of 1856. In the darkest pages of American history, hidden among official accounts and sanitized records, lies a story of revenge that challenged the most brutal system of slavery in the antebellum South. This is the narrative of Lydia Washington, a 28-year-old enslaved woman, who in September 1856 orchestrated one of the most extraordinary and bloody events of slave resistance ever documented in the cotton fields of Mississippi. The story begins at Riverdale Plantation, a 3,000-acre estate on the banks of the Mississippi River, owned by Colonel James Whitmore, one of the state's wealthiest and most influential men. Riverdale was known not only for its massive cotton production, but also for the extreme brutality with which its slaves were treated. Under the supervision of overseer Jeremiah Blackwood, a man with a sinister reputation even by the standards of the time, the plantation had become a living hell for the more than 400 slaves who worked its lands. Lydia was no ordinary slave. Born free in Louisiana, the daughter of a free black trader and a Choctaw Indian woman, she had been kidnapped at 15 by slave traders and illegally sold to Riverdale. During 13 years of captivity, she had witnessed and suffered atrocities that left scars, not only on her body but also on her soul. Unlike many slaves born into bondage, Lydia remembered freedom, and that memory fueled a hatred that grew with each passing day under Blackwood's whip. Overseer Jeremiah Blackwood was a man who found sadistic pleasure in the suffering of others. Tall, thin, with ice-cold eyes and a scar that ran from forehead to chin, the result of a fight with a rebellious slave years earlier. Blackwood had developed methods of punishment that went far beyond what was considered normal, even by the brutal standards of the time. He maintained a special barn where he conducted his disciplinary sessions, a place the slaves called the Shrieking Shack, and which would become the scene of his eventual downfall. During the summer of 1856, a series of events converged to create the perfect conditions for the ensuing outbreak of violence. The harvest had been exceptionally difficult due to a prolonged drought, prompting Blackwood to increase daily cotton quotas to impossible levels. Slaves who failed to meet their targets were subjected to increasingly severe punishments. It was during this period of rising tension that Blackwood made the mistake that would seal his fate. On a sweltering August afternoon, Lydia found her 12-year-old daughter Sarah unconscious behind the main barn, with marks that clearly indicated sexual abuse. The child had been raped by Blackwood, a crime that, though common on the plantations, was rarely punished or even acknowledged. For Lydia, this was the moment her grief transformed into something far more dangerous, a thirst for revenge that would consume everything in its path. Lydia began to plan meticulously. She knew that any act of direct resistance would result in her immediate death, but she also knew she could not live knowing that the man who had raped her daughter would remain free to repeat his crimes. Over the next few weeks, she began cultivating relationships with other slaves who had their own reasons to hate Blackwood. She identified those who had lost loved ones to the overseer's brutality, those who bore physical and emotional scars from their encounters with him. Lydia's plan was both simple and diabolical in its effectiveness. She would take advantage of the annual harvest festival, an event where the plantation's defenses would be relaxed, and where Blackwood, known for his drunkenness on these occasions, would be vulnerable. But Lydia didn't just want to kill Blackwood. She wanted him to suffer as she had made so many others suffer, and she wanted his death to serve as an example to any other white man who would consider abusing defenseless slaves. The formation of the silent conspiracy. In the weeks following the discovery of her daughter's violence, Lydia began weaving a web of conspiracy that would spread throughout Riverdale's enslaved population. She knew that to succeed, she would need more than anger. It would require careful planning, iron discipline, and the cooperation of dozens of people who normally wouldn't dare even look directly at a white person, let alone conspire against one. Lydia's first recruit was Marcus Thompson, a 40-year-old man who had been the plantation's slave driver before Blackwood arrived. Marcus had lost his status and privileges when the new overseer took over, being relegated to working the fields like any other slave. More importantly, Marcus had lost his wife 3 years earlier when Blackwood whipped her to death for disobedience, in reality for refusing his sexual advances. Marcus's pain and anger were palpable, but he possessed something equally valuable: intimate knowledge of the plantation's routine and access to areas normally off-limits to common slaves. Lydia approached Marcus during one of the rare water breaks in the fields. Speaking in a code developed among slaves over generations, she planted the seeds of her idea. "The demon that torments us will have his judgment," she whispered as she pretended to adjust the position of the cotton sack. Marcus understood immediately. Their eyes met for a brief moment and a silent agreement was sealed. The second conspirator was Big Jim, a 6-foot-tall giant whose strength was legendary even among the slaves. Jim had been specifically purchased for jobs requiring extreme brute strength, but his intimidating appearance hid a sharp mind and a gentle heart. Blackwood had marked Jim as a potential problem and subjected him to constant humiliation to break his spirit. Recently, Blackwood had forced Jim to whip his own sister as punishment for a crime she hadn't committed. The guilt and anger Jim carried made him a natural ally for Lydia's plan. The network grew carefully. Lydia recruited Mama Rose, an elderly woman who served as a midwife and informal healer for the slave community. Rose had lost 3 children to Blackwood's brutality over the years, and her influence among the plantation's women was considerable. She brought with her valuable knowledge of herbs and plants that could be useful in the unfolding plan. Samuel, the plantation blacksmith, joined the group, bringing access to tools and the ability to modify farm implements into improvised weapons. His workshop became a secret meeting place where the conspirators could gather under the guise of repairing equipment. Lydia also carefully recruited some of the domestic slaves who worked in the main house. Among them was Grace, a 16-year-old girl who waited on table during meals and had privileged access to the white people's conversations. Grace would provide crucial information about the white overseer's plans and movements. The most impressive aspect of Lydia's conspiracy was its cellular structure. She organized participants into small groups that knew only their immediate members and had limited contact with other groups. This compartmentalization protected the entire operation in case anyone was captured and tortured into revealing information. Each cell had a specific responsibility: intelligence, weapons, logistics, communications, and execution. To communicate between cells, Lydia developed a complex signaling system based on work songs, movement patterns in the fields, and seemingly random arrangements of objects. A hoe left at a specific angle meant a meeting was scheduled. A change in the lyrics of a spiritual song indicated new developments in the plan. A cloth hung in a particular way signaled danger or the need to abort operations. Recruitment was a slow and dangerous process. Lydia had to carefully evaluate each potential candidate, determining not only their trustworthiness and motivation, but also their ability to keep secrets under extreme pressure. She employed subtle testing techniques, making seemingly innocent comments and observing reactions, or sharing minor information to see if it spread. Only those who passed these rigorous tests were considered for inclusion in the inner circle. Discipline within the conspiracy was absolute. Lydia established clear rules. No discussion of the plan outside of designated meetings, no changes in behavior that might arouse suspicion, and preparation for total denial if confronted. She also instituted an internal surveillance system where members monitored each other for signs of vacillation or possible betrayal. As September approached, the conspiracy had grown to include more than 50 slaves, divided into 8 distinct cells. Each group had specific instructions for the day of execution, but only Lydia and her closest lieutenants knew the complete plan. This structure would ensure that even if parts of the operation were compromised, the central core could continue. The planning also included contingencies for various possibilities. If Blackwood didn't show up at the harvest feast, there were backup plans to lure him to isolated locations. If other whites interfered, there were strategies to deal with them. If the rebellion spread beyond its intended targets, there were escape routes planned for the key participants. Lydia knew she was orchestrating something that would forever change the lives of everyone on the plantation. There was no turning back once the plan was set in motion. But for a woman who had seen her daughter raped by the same man who had tortured and killed so many others, the need for justice outweighed any consideration of personal safety. If you're moved by Lydia's courage and determination to organize this complex resistance against such a brutal system, please show it by liking this video. Not only does your like motivate me to continue telling these powerful stories of historical resistance, but it also helps others discover these important accounts of the struggle against oppression. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about crucial moments in history that are often forgotten or ignored by conventional books. Foreman Blackwood, Portrait of a Monster. To fully understand the magnitude of the hatred Lydia and her companions harbored, it is essential to understand the nature of the man they conspired against. Jeremiah Blackwood was not simply a strict overseer carrying out his employer's orders. He was a genuine sadist who had turned slave supervision into a cruel art form, developing methods of torture and humiliation that went far beyond any economic or disciplinary necessity. Blackwood had arrived in Riverdale 3 years earlier, from an Alabama plantation, where rumors of his extreme cruelty had finally forced his previous employer to quietly dismiss him. Colonel Whitmore, always obsessed with maximizing his plantation's production, had been drawn to reports of Blackwood's ability to extract maximum labor from slaves through terror. What Whitmore didn't anticipate was that Blackwood's thirst for violence would eventually backfire, creating an environment of hatred so intense that it would threaten the stability of the entire operation. Physically, Blackwood was an intimidating figure. Tall and lean, with muscles hardened by years of manual labor before becoming a foreman, he moved with the predatory grace of a hunted animal. His icy blue eyes seemed capable of seeing right through people's souls, pinpointing fear and vulnerability with surgical precision. The scar that slashed across his face from his left forehead to the corner of his mouth was a constant reminder of his propensity for violence, the result of a confrontation with a rebellious slave who had tried to defend him with a scythe and paid with his life. Blackwood's punishment techniques were varied and elaborate. He kept an arsenal of torture instruments in his special barn, whips of varying weights and textures, branding irons heated to constant embers, shackles specially designed to inflict maximum pain, and devices of his own invention that combined psychological humiliation with physical torment. He often forced other slaves to watch his disciplinary sessions, using vicarious terror as a tool of control. But it was in his sexual abuse that Blackwood revealed his most despicable nature. He had established a systematic system of exploiting enslaved women, beginning with the youngest, as soon as they reached puberty. He justified these acts as necessary breaking to make the women more submissive, but the reality was that he simply enjoyed the absolute power his position gave him over human bodies and lives. The case of Lydia's daughter, Sarah, was not an isolated incident. Blackwood had developed a pattern of identifying women and girls who showed any sign of independence and subjecting them to sexual violence as a way to break their resistance. He kept some as forced concubines in a special hut behind his residence, where they were kept chained and available to his whims. Blackwood's brutality extended beyond physical and sexual violence. He had developed elaborate forms of psychological torture that left scars as deep as any physical wound. He forced fathers to whip their own children, husbands to watch their wives' rapes, and mothers to choose which of their children would be punished for the other's crimes. These sadistic games created traumas that reverberated through entire families and generations. Blackwood also demonstrated a knack for identifying and exploiting each slave's specific fears. Some were terrified of enclosed spaces, so he locked them in wooden boxes for days. Others feared heights, so he forced them to stand on elevated platforms exposed to the elements. Those who valued their families above all else saw loved ones threatened as a way to ensure submission. The espionage system Blackwood had established among the slaves was particularly insidious. He identified desperate or ambitious slaves and bribed them with small privileges in exchange for information about their companions' conversations and activities. These informants, known among the slaves as the serpents, created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that hindered any form of organization or resistance. Blackwood kept detailed records of his activities in diaries he kept locked in his home. These documents, discovered decades later by historians, revealed the systematic extent of his cruelty. He recorded not only punishments and their justifications, but also observations of the reactions of different slaves, experiments with new methods of control, and even bets he made with himself about how much suffering specific individuals could endure. Blackwood's moral corruption extended to his relationships with other whites on the plantation. He blackmailed lesser overseers with evidence of his own transgressions, forcing them to comply or ignore his most extreme orders. He also corrupted some of Whitmore's older sons, initiating them into his sadistic practices as a way to secure protection from any family interference. For all his cruelty, Blackwood was not stupid. He kept the plantation's production levels high enough to satisfy Whitmore, and he was careful to hide his more extreme activities from outside visitors who might cause legal or social problems. He had cultivated a reputation in the region as an effective overseer, and other plantation owners occasionally consulted him on slave management techniques. This combination of cruel intelligence, systematic sadism, and institutional protection made Blackwood virtually untouchable through normal channels. Slaves who attempted to report their abuse were brutally punished, and local authorities viewed such complaints as simply slaves trying to cause trouble for their superiors. The legal system offered slaves zero protection against abuse by their overseers, no matter how extreme. It was this reality, the complete impossibility of justice through legal or official means, that convinced Lydia that only direct violence could stop Blackwood's reign of terror. She had come to the conclusion that men like Blackwood could not be reformed, controlled, or deterred. They needed to be eliminated. Preparations for Judgment Night. As September wore on and the annual Harvest Festival approached, Lydia and her conspirators intensified their preparations for what they had begun to refer to among themselves as Judgment Night. Every detail needed to be meticulously planned, for they would have only one opportunity, and failure would mean not only their own deaths, but brutal retribution against every slave family in Riverdale. The first crucial aspect of the preparations was gathering intelligence about the specific plans for the harvest festival. Grace, the house slave who served in the main house, proved invaluable in this task. During the preceding weeks, she faithfully reported on the conversations she overheard between Whitmore family members and their guests about the celebration arrangements. She discovered that Blackwood had received special permission to organize his own separate festivities for the white overseers and foremen, a tradition he had established as a way to demonstrate his importance in the plantation hierarchy. This separate party would be held in the main barn, decorated for the occasion with fresh hay and lanterns. Blackwood had ordered extra barrels of whiskey and hired local musicians to entertain his guests. More importantly for Lydia's plans, Grace reported that Blackwood had boasted that this would be a night of special fun and had instructed several slaves to clean and prepare his discipline house for unspecified activities during the party. Samuel the blacksmith had spent weeks discreetly modifying farm tools into makeshift weapons. Scythes were sharpened to razor-sharp edges, hammers were balanced for use as weapons of war, and iron bars were shaped into instruments that could break bones with a single blow. Each weapon was carefully hidden in predetermined locations around the plantation, buried in fields or hidden in barns, always where they could be. Quickly accessed when needed, Mama Rose had prepared her own sinister contribution to the preparations. Using her knowledge of poisonous plants and medicinal herbs, she had concocted a variety of substances that might be useful during the execution of the plan. Some were designed to incapacitate, extracts that would cause severe nausea or disorientation when mixed into a drink. Others were lethal, plant concentrates that would cause agonizing death within hours. All were carefully stored in small vials hidden in her hut. Timing was perhaps the most complex aspect of the preparations. Lydia had established a precise schedule based on the party's known routines. The musicians would arrive at sunset and play until well after midnight. The white guests typically became intoxicated around 10 o'clock, and Blackwood traditionally retired for private activities between 11 and midnight. It was during this window that the plan would be executed. Each cell in the conspiracy received specific instructions regarding its responsibilities during different phases of the night. Marcus's group would be responsible for neutralizing other white supervisors who might interfere. Big Jim's cell would be tasked with controlling access to the main barn and preventing escapes. Mama Rose's group would provide distraction and confusion through controlled fires in secondary structures. The remaining cells would play supporting roles, creating diversions, providing last-minute information, and securing escape routes for the main perpetrators. Lydia also established communication protocols for the night of the event. Signals based on flashlight patterns would communicate the plan's progress between different groups. One flashlight in the barn's west window would mean Blackwood had reached the designated location. 2 flashlights would indicate he was alone and vulnerable. 3 flashlights would signal the beginning of the final phase. The psychological preparations were as important as the physical ones. Lydia spent hours with each conspirator, strengthening their resolve and preparing them for the brutal reality of what they were about to do. She reminded them of the crimes Blackwood had committed against their families, the humiliations he had inflicted, the lives he had destroyed. She also prepared them for the potential consequences, making it clear that some of them would likely die that night or in the following days. A crucial aspect of the preparations was securing the passive cooperation of slaves not directly involved in the conspiracy. Lydia couldn't risk anyone alerting white authorities, whether intentionally or accidentally. She implemented a subtle campaign of psychological preparation, spreading stories about Blackwood's injustices and cultivating an atmosphere where his eventual destruction would be seen as divine justice rather than a crime. Lydia also made personal preparations for the possibility of her own death. She wrote a letter, in the simple language she had secretly learned over the years, explaining her actions and asking her daughter's forgiveness for leaving her an orphan. This letter was hidden in a place where Sarah could find it years later, when she was old enough to understand the choices her mother had made. The final days before the feast were tense beyond description. Each conspirator had to continue their normal routines while carrying the knowledge of what was to come. They worked in the fields, served in the main house, and interacted with white overseers, all while knowing that within days, some of those same white people would be dead at their hands. Blackwood, unaware of the gathering storm, was particularly excited about the upcoming party. He had planned what he called a special entertainment for his guests, involving the public humiliation of several slaves he had selected for imaginary infractions. He had even built a special platform in the barn where he could conduct demonstrations of his disciplinary techniques for the amusement of other white overseers. The night before the party, Lydia gathered one last time with her inner circle, in an abandoned cabin on the edge of the plantation, lit only by the light of a single candle. They made their final vows to one another. Each person reaffirmed their commitment to the plan and their willingness to die if necessary to see justice done. They knew that after the next night, their lives would never be the same, if they even survived to see the dawn. The Harvest Festival and the beginning of terror. The morning of September 23, 1856, dawned clear and warm, with the kind of cloudless blue sky that promised a perfect evening for outdoor festivities. Throughout Riverdale Plantation, there was an air of anticipation that completely masked the deadly tension pulsing beneath the surface. For the white people, it was simply another year of celebrating a successful harvest. For Lydia and her conspirators, it was the day when years of planning and pent-up hatred would finally find expression. Preparations for the feast began at dawn. House slaves bustled about the main house, polishing silver and preparing food for the guests who would arrive later that afternoon. In the main barn, other slaves hung decorations and arranged tables and chairs borrowed from neighboring plantations. Blackwood personally oversaw these preparations, his mood visibly better than usual as he anticipated the pleasures of the evening ahead. Lydia, assigned to help with food preparation, worked in the main kitchen alongside Mama Rose and several other women. To casual observers, she appeared calm and focused on her tasks, but those who knew her well might have noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloguing every detail that might be relevant to the evening's events. As the afternoon wore on, guests began arriving from neighboring plantations. Foremen, supervisors, and a few smaller owners came with their families, all dressed in their finest for the occasion. They gathered on the porch of the main house, sipping mint juleps and discussing cotton prices, politics, and the growing rumors of tensions between North and South. Blackwood circulated among the guests like a proud host, receiving compliments on the organization of the party and the prosperous appearance of the plantation. He had dressed especially for the occasion in a new black suit with an embroidered vest and had meticulously trimmed his beard. To those unfamiliar with his true nature, he projected the image of a respectable Southern gentleman. While the whites socialized, the slaves continued their preparations under the discreet supervision of the conspirators. Grace reported that the guests appeared to be following the expected schedule, with the formal party scheduled to begin at sunset. Marcus confirmed that the hidden weapons positions remained secure and undetected. Samuel reported that all the modified tools were ready and that he had created a planned diversion in the workshop that would draw attention away from the barn at the crucial moment. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the estate, creating a magical atmosphere that contrasted ironically with the dark plans being finalized. Musicians arrived and began to play, filling the air with joyful melodies that completely masked the tension pulsing through the enslaved population. Blackwood toasted his guests as they gathered in the decorated barn, raising his glass of whiskey and proclaiming that this would be a night none of them would ever forget. He could not have imagined how prophetic that statement would prove. As the white party gained momentum, Lydia and her conspirators took up their final positions. Each person knew exactly where they were supposed to be and what they were supposed to do when the appropriate signals were given. The communication network they had developed over months was tested. One last time, with messages passing silently between cells through subtle signals and established codes. By 9 o'clock, the white guests were visibly intoxicated, their voices raised and their inhibitions lowered. Blackwood had drunk as much as any of them, but his alcohol tolerance, developed over years of abuse, meant he still had his faculties relatively intact. He began circulating among his guests, whispering about the special entertainment he had planned for later in the evening. At 10 o'clock, following the script established at previous parties, Blackwood announced that he had prepared a special demonstration for those interested in learning about advanced slave control techniques. Several of the guests, curious and intoxicated, expressed interest in seeing what he had planned. Blackwood led them toward the smaller barn he used for his discipline sessions, just as Lydia had predicted he would. Grace, positioned where she could observe the movement of the guests, turned on the first flashlight in the west window, signaling that Blackwood was moving toward the designated area. The signal was quickly relayed through the